Hey friends, I want to start today, y'all, by naming something that tends to show up quietly. Not in moments of crisis, but in the middle of your ordinary life. Those moments when nothing is technically wrong, but something still feels off. It's not broken, not falling apart, just unsettled. It's that feeling that creeps in when the rhythms that once worked don't quite fit anymore. When life hasn't imploded, but it also doesn't feel aligned. And often, without realizing it, our minds reach for the same solution. I need a reset. Not because we've failed, not because we've ruined anything, but because starting over feels cleaner than continuing does. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. I've lived that instinct more times than I can count across seasons that were gentle and seasons that changed everything. And today, I want to slow down and talk about why resets feel so compelling and what I've learned about when they truly help and when they quietly cost us more than we realize. This isn't a conversation about fixing yourself. It's about noticing patterns, the ones that we've learned to rely on, and making space for a different kind of forward motion. So wherever you are right now, I'm really glad you're here. Let's sit with this together. We live in a culture that loves the word reset. It's everywhere once you start paying attention. Reset programs, reset challenges, reset cleanses, reset your body, reset your mindset, reset your life. The words show up so often that it begins to feel essential, like forward progress depends on erasing what came before. And I don't know about you, but every time I see those messages, especially at the new year, something in me tightens just a little. Almost like I'm already behind if I haven't started over recently. Like continuing where I am is somehow less responsible than declaring a fresh start is. Reset language carries a promise. It promises relief. It promises clarity. It promises order when life feels undefined. It suggests that if things aren't working the way we want them to, the solution is to wipe the slate clean and begin again. And sometimes that really is true. There are moments when a restart is necessary, when something genuinely isn't working, when continuing as is would cause more harm than good. There are seasons where stopping, reassessing, and starting fresh is the wisest choice available. But there are also many moments when what we actually need isn't a reset at all. It's a return to routine, a gentle re-anchoring, a willingness to step back into the life we're already living instead of abandoning it altogether. Neither solution is bad. The tension comes when we treat every moment of discomfort as proof that we needed to start over. What I've noticed is that reset culture doesn't shape what we do. It shapes how we interpret ourselves. Over time, that constant invitation to start over begins to create an internal narrative that continuity is suspicious, that staying requires justification, that if things don't feel light, clear, or efficient, we must be doing something wrong. It trains us how to view discomfort as failure instead of information. And that internal pressure is quiet but persistent. It shows up as a low-grade sense of urgency, like we should always be fixing, tweaking, and restarting. Like we're behind if we haven't declared a new beginning recently. Even when we're still moving forward, even when growth is happening slowly and honestly, there's this subtle voice suggesting that progress only counts if it looks dramatic. I don't know about you, but that voice has made it harder for me to trust steady motion. It's made me second guess rhythms that were actually supporting me simply because they didn't feel new or exciting anymore. And over time, that erodes something important, our confidence in staying. That's where the confusion between reset and routine really starts to matter. Because there are moments when a reset is wise, when something truly needs to be interrupted or restructured. But there are just as many moments that what we need isn't a dramatic restart, but a return. a recommitment, a gentle re-entry into the practices that still serve us, even if they don't feel fresh. The problem is that a routine doesn't come with the same emotional payoff as a reset. It doesn't give us that rush of possibility. It doesn't promise instant relief. Routine asks us for patience. It asks us to trust the slow integration over the quick change. And in a culture that celebrates beginnings more than continuance, that's not easy. What reset culture often overlooks is that growth doesn't always feel expansive. Sometimes it feels repetitive. Sometimes it feels unremarkable. Sometimes it feels like choosing to stay again without the fanfare of a fresh start. And when we've lived through seasons that changed us deeply, staying can feel especially vulnerable. Because staying means carrying what we've learned forward instead of setting it down. It means honoring progress that doesn't fit neatly into a before and after story. That's the tension I keep running into, not because I was unwilling to grow, but because I hadn't yet learned how to trust movement that doesn't require an erasure. I've noticed this pattern in my own life across many seasons, and yes, nearly 5 decades of them now, which still makes me pause every time I say that out loud. There's a lot of living unpacked into that number. When you've lived through trauma, medical challenges, grief, and seasons that didn't just interrupt life but rearranged it entirely, the instinct to reset can feel especially seductive. Because when life has changed you deeply, starting over feels safer than where you are and figuring out how to live from here. Reset lets us believe that progress requires distance. The best way forward is to separate ourselves from the version of life that we're currently inhabiting. And often the urge to reset doesn't come from failure at all. It comes from discomfort, from the vulnerability of staying present in a season that doesn't come with clear instructions, from the tension of continuing without certainty that things will feel familiar again anytime soon, from the exposure of living in between what was and what might be. Resets feel decisive. Staying feels exposed. And it took me a long time to realize how often I was reaching for resets, not because something was broken, but because I didn't know how to continue without erasing parts of my story. That realization opened the door to a much harder question, one that I couldn't rush past. What happens when life doesn't offer us a clean slate? What happens when the season we're living in don't allow the neat beginning, when they ask us to carry forward, changed, and figure out how to live faithfully right from where we are? There are seasons when the conversation about reset shifts entirely, not because we've chosen to, but because life does it for us. There are seasons that don't just interrupt our routines, but rearrange the entire structure of our lives. Seasons shaped by medical realities, relationship realities, grief, loss, and seasons where the life that we're living no longer exists in quite the same way, and there's no version of going back that's available. I've lived through several of those seasons, and while each one looked different on the surface, they share a common thread. They require adaptation, not erasure. Some of those seasons involve medical realities that change how my body functioned and what I could expect from it. Others involve relationship shifts that altered the emotional landscape of my life. And some involve transitions so significant they compressed time itself, like becoming a mother of 2 children within 6 months. Beautiful, overwhelming, life-defining, and absolutely not something you reset your way through. Those moments don't offer clean slates. They offered responsibility. And they asked me to respond to a life that had already changed, not one that I could redesign from scratch. And yet, even then, I noticed how often my instinct was to still reach for a reset. Not because I wanted to escape those realities, but because I didn't know how to move forward within them. because staying in the middle of a reordered life felt vulnerable. It felt exposed. It required me to trust myself in a body, a story, and a season that no longer felt familiar. So instead of asking, how do I live faithfully from here? I often asked, how do I start over? And that's where the cost of resets begin to show up more clearly. Because in many of those moments, nothing was actually broken. I was learning, I was adjusting, I was doing the quiet work of integration, figuring out how to live with what had changed instead of pretending that it hadn't happened. But by framing those seasons as something that required a reset, I unintentionally treated progress as if it didn't count. Nothing was broken, but I treated it like it was. Every reset erased the evidence of growth. It dismissed the strength that it took to keep showing up, as I suggested that the only progress worth trusting was progress that looked new, clean, and uncomplicated. And over time, that pattern became exhausting. A constant day one, the repeated feeling of starting from scratch, the quiet discouragement that comes when you keep restarting, even though you've already learned so much. Maybe you felt that exhaustion too. Maybe life changed you in ways that you didn't ask for, through illness, loss, responsibility, or circumstance. And instead of honoring how you adapted, you felt pressure to become someone else entirely. Maybe you told yourself that you had to reset in order to be legitimate again, instead of trusting the wisdom that you were already carrying. That's a heavy burden to live under, because real life rarely hands us neat beginnings. It hands us continuity, often complicated, often tender, often unfinished. And when we keep trying to reset our way out of that complexity, we miss the deeper work of integration. Integration is slower than resetting. It's quieter. It doesn't come with the emotional rush of a fresh start, but it builds something far more durable. It builds trust, not in a system or a plan, but in ourselves, in our ability to carry forward what we've lived through and let it shape how we move next. It took me a long time to see that the fatigue I felt wasn't because I lacked discipline or motivation. It was because restarting had become a way to avoid the harder work of continuing. And that realization changed the question I was asking. Instead of how do I start over, I began asking what would it look like to re-enter honestly, imperfectly, and without erasing what I've already lived and done. For me, re-entry didn't come with a big announcement. There wasn't a moment where everything suddenly felt clear or resolved. It became quietly through a growing awareness that I didn't actually need a brand new plan. I just needed a more honest way to return. What I started to notice was that I kept treating discomfort as a signal to abandon what I was doing, instead of information about how to adjust. I was reaching for resets when what I really needed was discernment, not more effort, not better discipline, just clearer attention. One of those places this became the most obvious for me was around my health. Not because I hadn't learned anything, I had. And not because I didn't care, I did, but because I was standing at a crossroads between stacking new solutions and slowing down enough to ask what actually made sense for the season that I was living in. I found myself looking at supplements, schedules, routines, all of it, thinking that if I could just get the right combination, everything would fall back into place. And the truth was, I didn't need another overhaul. I needed to stop stacking and start choosing. So instead of resetting everything, I paused. I looked at what I was already doing. I paid attention to what was helping and what was just noise, and I made a decision to simplify. Not because I was giving up, but because I was choosing sustainability over urgency. I worked out a daily rhythm that fits my actual life, my energy, my sleep, my responsibilities, not the life I thought I should be living. That was the re-entry for me. Not erasing what I had learned, not pretending that I hadn't been interrupted, but continuing forward with what I already knew instead of abandoning it. And what surprised me is how much lighter that felt. Re-entry also changed the way I think about traction. I used to believe that traction meant waking up motivated, hitting every single goal, and feeling like the day clicked into place. But traction is quieter than that. Traction is what happens when you stop demanding perfection and start choosing what's sustainable, even when the day is messy. A reset usually comes with a whole new set of rules, and it feels urgent, driven by an internal kind of panic that says this can't be the way it is anymore. A return feels different. A return says, I know what anchors me. I know what helps me. I'm going back to what I know to be true, not because I'm behind, but because I'm human. That's why I've started asking myself a different question in the moment. Am I trying to reset because something is actually broken, or just because I'm uncomfortable? Because discomfort isn't always a sign of failure. Sometimes discomfort is grief. Sometimes it's growth. Sometimes it's just life being life. And the more I've lived, the more I've realized I don't want to make decisions from panic. I want to make them from clarity. One of the ways I've practiced this is by choosing what I think of as a minimum viable day. Not a lazy day, not a giving up day, a day where I still show up, but I don't demand the full version of myself when the season is requiring something smaller. For me, that looks like identifying 2 or 3 anchors, things that keep me grounded without overwhelming me. And instead of abandoning myself on hard days, I stay, I return, I continue. Because that's what resets used to do to me. They made me treat hard days like proof that I couldn't be trusted. The re-entry has taught me that hard days are part of the story, and I can stay with myself through them. I'm still learning this. I think that it's an important thing for me to say out loud that I'm still learning this, because re-entry isn't something you figure out once and then master. It's something you practice in real time, often without realizing that's what you're doing. There are days when re-entry feels steady and grounded, when choosing continuity over urgency comes natural. And then there are days when the old instinct to reset shows up loudly, usually when I'm tired, overwhelmed, or discouraged. Those are the moments when it's easiest to believe that starting over would feel better than staying present. What I'm learning, though, is that those moments aren't invitations to abandon what I've built. They're invitations to check back in, to ask, what am I actually needing right now? More rest, more structure, more honesty, maybe less pressure? Because often I used to label that as falling off, when it was really just my system asking for more recalibration. Instead of listening, I would respond with intensity, stricter rules, bigger plans, louder resolve. Re-entry has been teaching me to respond differently, to soften instead of escalate, to adjust instead of overhaul, to stay curious instead of judgmental. This has changed the way I think about discipline too. I used to believe that discipline meant doing the full version of everything every day, no matter what. And now I'm realizing that discipline can also mean knowing when to scale back without quitting. It can mean choosing consistency over performance. It can mean trusting that showing up imperfectly still counts as showing up. There's a humility in re-entry that I'm still learning to accept. It asks me to admit that I don't always know the best way forward immediately, and that's okay. It asks me to believe that wisdom doesn't disappear just because circumstances change. And it reminds me that I don't need to erase my past to make room for growth. I think this is where re-entry becomes more than a personal practice. It becomes a way of relating to ourselves with compassion. It invites us to stop treating ourselves like projects that need constant fixing and start seeing ourselves as people who are allowed to evolve over time. And maybe that's the quiet shift underneath all of this. that we don't actually need more motivation or more willpower or more dramatic declarations. We need trust in ourselves, in the process, in the work of integration that doesn't always feel impressive, but builds something that lasts. Re-entry has been teaching me that staying doesn't mean settling. It means choosing to remain engaged with my own life, even when it's imperfect, even when it's unfinished, even when it looks different than I imagined. And that feels like a kind of faithfulness that I want to keep practicing. I think that what I'm slowly coming to understand is that re-entry asks for a different kind of courage than starting over does. Starting over lets us imagine the future, a future version of ourselves who won't make the same mistakes, who won't carry the same limitations, who won't feel the same weight. Re-entry doesn't offer that illusion. It asks us to show up as we are, shaped by what we've lived, informed by what we've learned, and honest about what still feels tender. And that honesty can feel risky because re-entry means we don't get to pretend that the hard parts didn't matter. We don't get to bypass grief or skip over seasons that stretched us too thin. We carry them forward, not as proof that we're broken, but as evidence that we've endured. There's a quiet strength in that kind of continuation that I'm still learning to trust. It's the strength to say, I don't need to become someone else to keep going. The strength to believe that wisdom accumulates, even when progress feels uneven. The strength to stay present with myself on days when motivation is low and clarity feels so far away. Re-entry has often softened the way that I talk to myself. Instead of asking, why can't I just get it together? I've started asking, what is this moment asking of me? Sometimes that answer might be rest. Sometimes it might be more structure. Sometimes it's just returning to something something familiar that still works, even if it doesn't feel exciting anymore. That shift has been subtle, but it's been so powerful because it's helped me to stop interpreting every hard day as a personal failure. It's helped me to see that inconsistency doesn't erase integrity, that needing to adjust doesn't mean I've lost ground, that growth isn't invalidated just because it isn't dramatic. And maybe that's the part of re-entry that matters the most, the way that it restores trust. Trust that I can stay with myself through seasons that don't resolve quickly. Trust that I don't need to punish myself into progress. And trust that continuity can be faithful even when it's quiet. I don't think re-entry is about lowering the bar. I think it's about choosing a bar that reflects reality instead of fantasy. A way of living that honors effort without demanding perfection, and a way of continuing that leaves room for grace. And if I'm honest, that feels like the kind of growth that I want, not the kind that looks impressive from the outside, but the kind that actually lasts. There are still moments that I want relief, the relief of a clean slate, but I'm realizing that the relief doesn't last if the approach isn't sustainable. Life will always get messy again, and re-entry is what lets me keep going without erasing myself in that process. Before we talk about continuing, I think it's important to name why re-entry can feel so much harder than a reset in the first place. Resets give us emotional distance. They create a clean edge between what was and what's next. They let us believe that the weight that we've been carrying can be left behind, even if just for a moment. And when life has been heavy, when it's changed us, marked us, or stretched us, that kind of distance can feel like a relief. Re-entry doesn't offer that same comfort. Re-entry asks us to stay connected to what we've lived through. It doesn't let us pretend we're untouched. It invites us to move forward with our story instead of away from it. And that can feel vulnerable, especially if parts of that story still ache or feel unresolved. I think that's why resets often are framed as strength, while staying is quietly misunderstood. Because staying requires trust. Trust that continuity is not the same thing as stagnation. Trust that wisdom doesn't disappear just because the season is difficult. Trust that you don't have to become someone new in order to keep going. And when you've spent years navigating disruption, when your life has been shaped by experiences that you didn't choose, that trust doesn't come easily. It's built slowly through repeated decisions to remain present instead of reaching for the escape hatch. That's what reentry has been teaching me. It's not about pushing forward harder. It's about letting myself arrive where I already am without judgment. It's about resisting the urge to erase the past just to feel hopeful again. It's about believing that healing doesn't always look like a clean slate. Sometimes it looks like learning how to live gently inside the life that you've been given. I think one of the quiet gifts of reentry is that it asks us to be honest about where we are, without demanding that we be different before we are allowed to move forward. It reminds us that growth doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like continuing, like adjusting, like choosing not to abandon what's already been built just because it doesn't feel shiny anymore. We don't talk about that enough. How much courage that it takes to keep going without the emotional rush of a reset. How vulnerable it feels to stay present in a life that has already changed you instead of pretending that you can start over untouched. But the truth is, most of us aren't meant to live in a series of clean slates. And I think that that's why the word reset can feel so spiritually tempting too, even when we don't mean it that way, because it offers a version of redemption that's instant, a version of grace that feels like an eraser instead of a companion. But real healing usually isn't an eraser, it's a steady presence. It's learning to live with what you've lived through without letting it define you in the most painful ways. It's learning to carry your story with tenderness instead of dragging it behind you like proof that you're disqualified. It's learning to stop interpreting every dip, every detour, every hard week as evidence that you're back at zero. And if you need a sentence to hold on to this week, let it be this: a hard week doesn't cancel a healed life. A hard day doesn't erase a steady rhythm. A moment of I don't know what I'm doing doesn't mean that you've lost everything that you've learned. It just means that you're human. You're still here and you're still becoming. And what surprised me was how much lighter that felt. Reentry also changed the way I think about traction, because I used to believe that traction meant I woke up, felt motivated, and hit all the goals, and everything clicked into place. But traction is actually much quieter than that. Traction is what happens when you stop demanding perfection from the day and start choosing what's sustainable, even when the day is messy. And that's where I've had to learn the difference between a reset and a return in real time, not just in theory. A reset usually comes with a whole new set of rules. It feels urgent. It's driven by a kind of internal panic that says, this can't be this way anymore. A return feels different. A return says, I know what helps me and I know what anchors me. I'm going back to what I know to be true, not because I'm behind, but because I'm human. So here's the question I've been asking myself in the moment, and maybe this will help you too. Am I trying to reset because something is actually broken, or because I'm uncomfortable with what I'm doing? Because discomfort isn't always a sign that you're failing. Sometimes discomfort is just the feeling of building. Sometimes it's grief. Sometimes it's hormones. If you're a certain age, you know this. Sometimes life is being life. And the more that I've matured, the more I've realized I don't want to make decisions from panic. I want to make decisions from clarity. One of the ways I've practiced that is choosing what I call a minimum viable day. Not a lazy day, not a giving up day, a day where I still show up, but I don't demand the full version of me when the season is requiring a smaller version. So instead of I have to do everything, it becomes what are the 2 or 3 things that I can do when I'm at my worst? Maybe for you that looks like protein at breakfast and a short walk. And maybe it looks like take your meds, drink your water, and go to bed at a reasonable time. Or maybe it looks like one honest conversation, one boundary, and one moment of prayer. Whatever your anchors are, the point is that you don't abandon yourself on those hard days. Because that's what resets used to do to me. They made me treat hard days like proof that I couldn't be trusted. And instead, re-entry teaches me that the hard days are just part of the story and I can stay with myself through them. And I'll be honest, this isn't something I've mastered yet again. I'm learning it while I live it. There are still moments that I want to go scorched earth and start over, just so that I can feel the relief of a clean slate. But I'm realizing that the relief doesn't last if the approach isn't sustainable. The clean slate always gets messy again, just because life is still life. Re-entry is the practice of returning without shame. And the more I practice it, the more I realize what I thought was a discipline problem was often just an integration problem. I didn't need harsher rules. I needed gentler consistency. We're meant to live cumulatively, carrying what we've learned, letting our experiences shape us, trusting that wisdom grows through interaction, not erasure. That the life we're living right now, as complicated and unfinished and sometimes tender that it is, it's still a valid place to continue from. If you've been feeling the pressure to reset lately, I want to gently release you from that idea that forward progress requires you to undo everything that's already happened. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is re-enter our own lives with compassion, to stop treating discomfort as failure, to trust that steadiness counts even when it doesn't look dramatic. And maybe this week, re-entry for you doesn't look like a big decision or a bold declaration. Maybe it looks like returning to one small practice, or honoring what you already know, or simply allowing yourself to stay without judgment. Wherever this conversation finds you, I hope that it gives you permission to continue, not perfectly, not urgently, but honestly. Because you don't need a reset to move forward. You need trust, you need patience, you need room to stay, and you're allowed to begin again without starting over. Most of us aren't meant to live in a series of clean slates. If this episode met you in a tender place, I hope you'll be gentle with yourself as you carry it with you this week. You don't have to decide anything today. You don't have to fix anything. Sometimes the most faithful thing that we can do is simply notice and let noticing shape how we move forward one small step at a time. If someone came to mind while you were listening, someone who might be tired of starting over or quietly wondering how to keep going, feel free to share this episode with them. You never know what permission it might offer. And if you want to stay connected, you can follow my podcast wherever you're listening. I'd also love to hear from you. I read every message, and I'm always grateful when you take time to reach out. In the show notes, there are also links to all of my social media platforms. New long-form episodes release on Mondays with shorter devotional episodes on Thursday if that rhythm is helpful for you. Thanks for being here, friends. I'm really glad that you're walking this road with me.